Good to see you. Thanks for making time for the check-in meeting today. We've got 2 items on the agenda today. But before we head into those, Ross, anything from you?
Just a quick announcement that Dave's going to make on the work program update. Dave?
Okay.
Thanks, Ross. So this is largely a good news update, nothing ominous at all, but we thought with the timing of the meeting, it'd be good for members to know exactly what was going on with the work program. The task force had a meeting on Tuesday and we went through our final review of the document. A few edits. We're looking to publish it next Wednesday, July 28th. It will be published with supporting documents. One will be our at a glance. It will have 2 webcasts attached, one probably from Ross and I, so a staff webcast, another short one from Ian, just introducing the document, and then we'll also have our normal press release. The only change of substance we're making to the document, and this is where the task force had a good discussion, was on Appendix B. And Appendix B was the list of projects that the IPSASB considered back in March when we first discussed this. And I guess after a lot of iterations, but what we really discussed was the length of Appendix B was really taking away from what we were trying to focus on in the consultation. We really wanted to focus on those 6 projects. So what we did was we moved away from the longer list and moved back to just those 6 projects to really focus our readers. And what the task force advised is when we come back and start our next strategy, I guess in a year or 2, or start developing our next strategy, staff should bring that full list back so the IPSASB can really go through it in detail and decide which projects are still on and which should come off. So again, I just thought because we just had our task force meeting and we're wrapping it all up, I just wanted members to know fully what was going on, and so you guys knew exactly what the release date was in case it comes up with any of your constituents. So Rossi, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks for that summary of the discussion that we had in the task force the other day. And I think we recognise that there were pros and cons to whichever route we went, but I think the dominant view was that we hadn't done a full review of all the potential projects that we had around, and therefore there were a number of them where you felt, well, perhaps this has been overtaken by something else, perhaps we haven't really had time to research this and so on. And actually at this stage as a group we were reasonably happy with the projects that we were going to recommend. We weren't happy with that much longer list that was current, and therefore at this stage, given that we were just looking at which projects we were going to add rather than to reopen the strategy, that was the appropriate way to go, just to actually give the details of the analysis on those projects that we're recommending. But the task force felt that was important, that the board just understood that, because clearly there have been different views all the way through, but that's what we're going to go with in terms of the published version. Okay, so with that, I think we move into the first of the 2 items. And Edwin, over to you just to introduce the item and what's been done since we saw this not that long ago in June.
Thanks, Ian. Okay, so I'll share my presentation and I'll quickly go over the slides, but the key point of this session, I think, will be more of a section by section flip of the CP, which we'll get to in a bit. So just to summarize what we're planning to do for this session, I'm going to go through the changes that we've made to chapters 1 and 2 of the consultation paper, and then we're going to have the section by section flip, and the last slide will be a discussion on the proposed structure of the remaining chapters of the CP, which has been included in Appendix A of the paper. I guess before I start, I guess I'll pause here and ask if Ian or Lindy have any comments on the project as a whole.
So thanks, Edwin. And I think, probably the key thing was that we had a lot of good discussions on this project, both in March and in June. And I think that started to sharpen up what the issues were. And what Edwin has done is sort of work with Lindy as task force chair and myself in terms of trying to sort of sharpen up the structure in response to the comments that were made, particularly in June, about amount of material placement, narrative, following the flow, and so on. And that's where the sort of structure that you've seen for chapters 3 and onwards comes from, and there was a similar plan for chapters 1 and 2, really to get that focus and to start to identify where we saw the preliminary views. So that was responding to the discussions that we've had, but also trying to put us in a good place for moving forward. And that's really what we wanted to do today, was to get your views on how chapters 1 and 2 are shaping up, now following that review, and then on the skeleton outline for the rest of the paper. Lindy, I don't know whether you want to add anything at all.
I'm good for now, thank you.
Okay, so with that, Edwin, if you can take us into the papers, please.
Okay, so the first part of the paper is really summarizing the changes to chapter 1. So I won't go through bullet by bullet on the slide, but overall, there were no new technical material in chapter 1. It was really just a restructuring. And as Ian said, we're really sharpening what we have put in before and streamlining this chapter. So you'll notice that a lot of the background material and a lot of the supporting material has been moved to Appendix A, or our plan is to move it to the appendices in the resource-specific chapters, which we'll discuss in September. The one key change we did make was to revise the general description per the June instructions, and we have revised the P fee accordingly. So I guess at this point, I think it'll be best to pause here and then go section by section in the chapter. So I'll take my slide away. But and I did receive comments from some board members, so I'll bring those up as we're going through. But in terms of the very first section of chapter 1, we have set out the reasons for undertaking this project. So again, this was nothing new from before. We've just repurposed some of the paragraphs to really talk about why we're doing this project. So I guess I'll pause and ask members if they have any comments on this section. And in terms of where this is located, it is on page 19 of the PDF that was posted.
Thanks, Edwin. So we'll go through section by section. So any comments on that, what's been done in terms of the reasons for undertaking the project or the project aims, those first two sections? Yeah, Renee, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Paragraph 1.2, the criteria, assessing the criteria for the project. When we look at B, consequences, I find that we've taken a lot out of some of the details that we had in the prior version to articulate the implications of not having information on natural resources before extraction in financial reporting. And then when we read this paragraph B, consequences, it seems incomplete. It falls flat, I find, to a certain extent. It also seems to repeat a bit of what we have in prevalence up in paragraph A. So I felt we lost some substance, and I would want to suggest that we add back. There's one sentence in the old version, the first version, it was paragraph 2C, lack of information for decision making. And there was a good sentence there about the implications regarding intergenerational fairness, impact on government, on the environment and sustainability. So I feel it would make more of a substantial comment here if we added that back. Thank you.
Okay, so Edwin, if you can work with Renee just in terms of removing the duplication with the section on prevalence, but adding the sort of necessary material back to address those points. I mean, with this, obviously, we're trying to strike the balance between being succinct, but also making those important points that you raised. So thanks for that, Renee. Mike. And I should say, in terms of this is comments of principle, editorials can go to Edwin out of session.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Chair. I had a question just at the heading, and my question may be resolved when we look at the finalised contents pages, which are not yet complete. But the purpose and scope, the chapter actually deals with more than just purpose and scope, because it gets into discussing the general definition. So I was just wondering if we can't maybe broaden the heading. And then I had a question, as Renee's got on 1, 2, C and D, and this whole question about the importance of disclosure. So disclosure doesn't get a mention in urgency, and I think it should. And indeed, there's a reference to presentation. Then we define what presentation is in a footnote. But it's throughout the document, I got confused about where we are wanting disclosure as against presentation as against something else, and where do we want that to be in the financial statement or in a RPG or somewhere else. So I'm happy to sort of take those comments offline with Edwin, but that's an area that just worried me in the whole document.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I can see the point in terms of presentation, given where the recommendations are going later on. So I think if we can pick that up, because it, as you say, it talks about recognition and measurement, but that's important. Yeah, so Lynn?
Yeah, I support what Mike says, and I was sort of hesitant about whether or not this is just an editorial, but linked to that point in 1A, in the middle line, we talk about the reporting of natural resources as assets, whereas we might end up disclosing natural resources that aren't assets, that don't meet their criteria. So I think we should be removing the word as assets there.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. I think that's a good point. Okay, so we make that change, deletion of as assets in 1A, but then there's Mike's point in 1B on presentation. Okay.
I just want to bring up for the presentation point. So we used to say presentation and disclosure, but I got a comment from a member that says in the framework, we actually have disclosure within presentation. So that's why they've requested to, I guess, delete the references to disclosure. So if the board decides that we should separate them out, I can reverse that change and make it everywhere.
Well, I think, can we just make that change consistent with the framework? And the framework, the chapter is presentation, disclosure is a subset of presentation. So we need to be entirely consistent with the usage in the framework. So I think that's the instruction there. David.
Yeah, thank you. I'd echo that point, and I would also echo Mike's point. I got confused once or twice because the terms seem to be used interchangeably. So I think your instruction is good.
Okay. Thanks for that. So, you know, and I think that underlines we're actually, you know, beginning to polish this section up quite nicely. So does anybody have any comments on the project aims or project scope sections? Yeah, Lynn.
I just had a comment on the project scope section on 1.9, and I felt that the argument in the however sentence felt a bit weak to me. I don't have a magic wand of an answer as to what it should do, but it just felt a bit weak to say that those issues just relate to rights of access and therefore go somewhere else.
It probably is a drafting point, Lynn. I think that the point is this is about tangible items rather than intangibles, and it just needs to be made perhaps more robustly to address your point. So Edwin, if you can have a look at the wording on that and get that straight. Okay, so I've got Renee and then Mike.
Yes, thank you. Project AIM in paragraph 1.61.7, we make the point that this CP is going to focus on the accounting, and that's fine. We refer to some constituents who advocated for a broader discussion, and basically we say that long-term sustainability, while it's important, these issues are not related directly to accounting, and therefore we're not going to deal with them in this CP. So it's okay. I totally agree with the direction, but it's in explaining it. And I wonder if there would be an opportunity here to signal that we eventually will be considering what else we could do as part of our future plans to demonstrate that we're not forgetting about it. So it's more just signaling it as opposed to the way right now it seems like it's shutting the door on it when you read it like this.
Thanks, Renee. I think that's a good point, because bearing in mind when we're likely to issue this document, we will have said quite a lot more on sustainability reporting there. So I think we need probably, Edwin, to include some appropriate links and to get that sense into that, because it will be important in terms of positioning. Okay, thanks for that. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So my question was in 110. And it was the sentence that it starts, however. In that sentence, we talk about activity-related guidance, and I didn't know what activity-related guidance meant, and I just wondered, it comes up much later in the document, explains what that means, but when I read it early on in the document, it threw me, I didn't know what it meant, and maybe a cross-reference from there would be helpful, because I don't know, because some of that guidance in other international standards is also accounting guidance, not activity guidance.
Do we actually need that sentence? I think it may be that it's easier just to take that out at this stage.
Yep.
I don't think we lose anything. Okay, so we delete that. Lindy.
Thank you. Just in a discussion when we were looking at this here locally, we were wondering perhaps if the scope section gets swapped around with the developing the general description. So you kind of have the description and then you have the scope underneath that, because, you know, the general description should actually lend itself to what would be in and out of the scope. And kind of have then there, we also say that it's tangible, and then afterwards we say, well, electromagnetic is out because it's intangible. I think it might just help that we're not making rules up front in terms of what the project is about. We've actually developed a description, and then flowing from that, we've kind of determined what the scope would be and what the focus would be.
Thanks, Lindy. I mean, I think there are some chickens and eggs here, if you'll pardon the expression.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of which came first, scope of the project or the description. Edwin, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so we did consider that comment, and I'm a bit hesitant to swap the ordering, because that kind of implies that the scope was based on the general description, but that's not actually how this was developed. The scope was really based on what constituents have told us to look at. And I guess reading this now, like, we kind of took that piece of the explanation away, but I can add that back in to say that the ones that we're focusing on is really driven by what constituents told us to focus on. So that'll make it more clear. So I can add that back. Yeah.
Okay, that sounds like that addresses Linda's point. Okay, so shall we move then on to the developing a general description section, which I don't think has changed that much since last time. Lynn.
So my comment was on paragraph 113, where we sort of are not clear whether or not we intend to go for a definition or not in the future. We just simply say we might think about a definition in the future. But I wonder if that's really the case, because actually up until now we did try to come up with a definition, and we ended up preferring a general description. So I wonder if we ought to be stronger to say our intention is to stick with a general description and put that as a preliminary view and seek specific comment on it, rather than have we may or may not look at a definition later, because we haven't asked for specific comment on it. So I wondered if that ought to be a PV instead. Ian, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I just realised that. So I can see your concern there, Lynn, and I wonder whether, because actually, ultimately, whether we have a definition or not is actually a matter for the board rather than for constituents. In a sense, it may just be easier to take that sentence out at this stage, because actually what we really want to get is their comments on the description as proposed. And frankly, we really don't need to go into whether we may formalise that as a definition or not. That would be something that we would decide later. So I think if you're happy with that, my proposal at this stage will be we just delete that we really don't need to get into that. That's okay. Lucy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Actually, my comment is also on the a proposed general description of natural resources. That it says that it is a resource provided as described in the IPSASB conceptual framework. Now, if you look at paragraph 5.7 of the conceptual framework, resource was described as an item with service potential or the ability to generate economic benefits. So this criterion is also considered as one of the recognition criteria of an asset as prescribed in paragraph 5.6 of the IPSASB conceptual framework. And this was comprehensively discussed in paragraphs 2.4 to 2.6 of chapter 2 of the CP. I suggest, therefore, that instead of the general description of natural resources, that we are making reference to the IPSASB conceptual framework, then we have to couch it in general terms. Hence, we can apply the definition as a resource and resource or an item with service potential or the ability to generate economic benefits. And then so we don't refer. I mean, we have to be straightforward in defining the resource without reference anymore to the IPSASB conceptual framework. And then the discussion in paragraph 1.6 of chapter 1 may also include the referral to paragraphs 2.4 to 2.6 of chapter 2. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I mean, Lucy, I'm given that we settled this last time round in terms of the description, I think I'm reluctant to kind of reopen that in quite the way that you've suggested. But Edwin, perhaps you've got some thoughts on how we deal with Lucy's point.
I would tend to agree that as it is now, like, I don't think it will hurt the definition, because we do actually describe what a resource is in the very next paragraph in 1.16. So, like, to me, I don't think it will improve anything if we actually expand 1.15a to talk about what a resource is. I mean, I welcome any thoughts from the board on this, but like, to me, it seems to almost make the general description too wordy if we actually move that in there.
I mean, could we just not put a footnote in which gives that reference? And then I think Lucy, so that would footnote the resource, and then I think that does deal with the point. That's okay. Okay. Patricia and then Mike.
Thank you. My point is in relation to 1.16 in the last sentence, because I think it's limits the scope of what we are considered the natural resource. The sentence said, when considering these characteristics, items can only be considered natural resource if they are capable of being extracted or harvested. And I think it's not, I think in the previous discuss, the decision is not to limit only for natural resource, maybe extract or harvest. For example, natural resource may be may have served potential without being extracted or harvested. And some legislation, in fact, restricts these activities. And it is not aligned, for example, with the paragraph 2.26 and in relation to preservation. Then my point here is delete or considering in other way this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. Edwin, back on that.
Yeah, I think we can definitely rephrase the last sentence to just say that they're capable of generating economic benefits or have service potential, and just leave out the extracted or harvested part. I think that will clarify that point.
Sorry, I wonder if you do that, Edwin, whether actually you need that sentence, because then it just says the same as the previous sentence.
Yeah.
So I think it may be that, actually we don't need to get into that. Obviously, we will discuss that later in the, the sections on the particular areas. So I think we can just take that sentence out at this stage. And then I think that, we just have the sentence before. Okay. And I think we, obviously we can revisit the specific issues when we get into the later chapters. Okay. Thanks for that. So I think then we are, Edwin, did you want to come back? And then I'll
Yes, sorry, I got an email about the paragraph 1.18, and it's on the point on human intervention. So one of the members commented or asked if we should qualify that and say subjected to significant human intervention. And their concern was that human intervention is tied to control. So if we exclude all types of human intervention, then it's almost like we're automatically saying that we can never control a natural resource. And I guess personally, my thoughts is that it wouldn't necessarily be an automatic exclusion. I think we still have to look at the specific facts and circumstances for each resource and conclude whether there is control. I don't think it's an automatic. So my thought is to leave out the significant qualifier.
I mean, I think if we introduce significant, then there will always be debates and discussions about what the nature of significant is. And I think we're better off actually dealing with that in terms of guidance, on the nature of intervention and materiality and things like that. So I think we'll, as you suggest, not include significant. Okay, Renee.
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is exactly the point I also wanted to make about human intervention. So Edwin, you're clarifying that not necessarily all human intervention would result in a scope out. But then the way the first sentence is written, it's very categorical. Natural resources must not have been subjected to human intervention. So I also reacted to this as thinking that it was too narrow. I do recall from our last meeting some members referring to even recall in the old version of the CP, paragraph 114, referring to the discussion about if you remove a couple trees from a forest, that doesn't prevent the forest itself from remaining a natural resource. I mean, that's been taken out of chapter 1. I suspect it will show up again, maybe in chapter 3 or 4. So I have the same reaction. I think it's too narrow at this stage.
Okay, so we need to have a bit of a look at that drafting. Ross, did you want to come in on that before I then go?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think if we simplified the first and second sentence to put them together, where it talks about modifying the quantity and quality of the natural resource, I think it'll be more clear that it needs to be intervention that's impacting the quantity and quality. It's not just any human intervention. I think that's getting lost because of the split in the sentences. And I do think there'll be more in the various chapters to come that will get more into what we mean by that based on the different topic. So I think maybe that's a point that we can come back to as we get further into the chapters, because I don't think we have to solve all the issues up front, as long as we're not, misrepresenting what we mean on the principle itself, because we're going to revisit those in the various chapters.
Thanks, Ross. I think that's a helpful suggestion, helpful way forward. I saw a thumbs up to that, and I think, Renee, you'll be okay with that, that approach. Okay, that's good. So I'll go to Mari, and then I go to Thomas.
Thank you. From my point of view, I agree with Renee, and human intervention has a so broad meaning. Broad sense. In the broad sense, it includes the prevention and conservation of the natural resources. So we have to focus on the financial reporting objectives. So the economic benefits and service potential is so important factors, and so we have to clarify the definition of the human intervention. We have also the such like the Act law about the prevention of the air pollution or water pollution. How we can deal with such kind of prevention and conservation of the natural resources. It's my challenging question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mari. So I think, just reflecting back on, I mean, this clearly is going to be an area of tension, but actually in the description, it's about in its natural state. So the intervention is actually the exception to that. And I think we will unpack that later. I think, Mari, you brought up a number of interesting points which will impact on various types of natural resources. And I think probably the thing to do, Edwin, is if you can note those points that Mari has alluded to, and then make sure that we address those, in the appropriate subsequent chapters. Okay, so if we have those as instructions for now. Thomas, you've been waiting, so over to you. And good morning. No? Good afternoon for you, I think.
Yeah, even here in Germany, it's good afternoon. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Ian. And just want to come back to kind of what the kind of writer of the email was saying, and what Renee just said. In the CAG, we also discussed the tension between kind of the description and the kind of control criteria. And when I look back at my notes to prepare for this session, I just realized that the main problem to understand what is finally in the scope of the standard are two aspects, which on the first view look like irresolvable contradiction. One is that the entity needs to have control understood as the ability to use the resource as part of fulfilling the asset definition. And the other one is that the natural resource needs to be in its natural state, so that it must not have been subject to human intervention. Very often, however, human intervention is necessary to create the ability to use the resource, in other words, to create control. And I think that should be clarified, and probably not starting with the human intervention, but starting with control, to say control does not necessarily need human intervention. There might be natural resources where you need human intervention to achieve control or the ability to use the service potential, but it's not necessarily the case. I think that should be clarified, this tension, either in 118 or in 2.7, where we talk about control.
Thanks, Thomas. I think it probably is a chapter 2 issue, actually, because
yes, I agree.
You know, this is very much about scope. It's about the description, so it gets people into what may be in there, and then you get into the issues around control in chapter 2. So I think that's where we'll pick that point up. Okay. So can I then just have any comments on either the application section 119 through to 121, or just the remaining structure paragraphs through to 124? Okay, so I'm not seeing any flags raised on those. So I think we can then move into chapter 2. Edwin, do you want to say anything up front before we start just moving through section by section?
I guess, yeah, it probably will be a better use if we just jump right into the section by section. Like, my slides don't really add anything.
Okay, that's fine. So if we can take comments on 2.1 and 2.2. Mike.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Edwin. So paragraph 1 is an example, and sorry, paragraph 2.1 and 2.2 is an example of where I was getting struggle between financial statements we're talking about. So in the little diagram, it talks about under recognition criteria to be recognized as an asset in the financial statements. And in the blue box, it talks about GPFRs, which are not financial statements, and so on. So I just want clarity around which documents or which things are we actually talking about here. But as I said earlier, I'll have a chat to Edwin offline about where I think that keeps coming up.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I think that's right. We do need to be clear, and this goes particularly to your point about presentation. So yeah, if we can make sure that that is used, those terms are used consistently, and we may need to actually just bolster that with an additional sentence or something at that point to make sure that that frame of reference is clear. Okay. So I'm not seeing any other flags up. So if we then go into the section on definition of an asset, which is through to paragraph 211, 2.3 through to 211. Okay, David, I think you were first in, followed by Patricia and then Lynn.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a little bit concerned, I think, about paragraphs 2.5 and 2.6 in particular, where I think we start straying into things that perhaps ought to be left to the specific chapters on the type of resources. And I'm wondering whether actually some of 2.5 and 2.6 could be replaced by the sort of wording that's in 2.9 and 2.11, which actually says, well, there are issues that we need to discuss about this, and they'll be discussed in the relevant chapters. I just think we might be sort of raising some sort of false expectations in these particular paragraphs.
Okay, thanks, David. I think that, as they are now general, that is a concern, and we do need to make sure we're consistent on referencing forward to specific discussions rather than picking them up. So, Edwin, if you can pick that up generally, but specifically with reference to 2.5 and 2.6. So I think, Tricia, that was your point. I'll now go to Lynn, and then Lucy, and then Mike.
Yeah, so I had a similar point around 2.5, but where we end up with in this chapter, or we could just push it all to other chapters, is we shouldn't lose sight. I think it was Patricia that said about actually preserving could be meeting your service objectives. And so when we talk about, if we're talking about service potential generally, we shouldn't assume that it's only met by doing something with the resource. So we just need to be careful there. My other points then were on 2.10 and 2.11. In 2.10, we use the example of gaining control of developing the resource, and I guess it's back to, I think, Thomas's point around how can you develop the resource without human intervention, which takes you out of scope. So I think we need to be careful when we're using developing the resource here. But then what I then get left with in these two paragraphs is then I can only control if I've had some sort of transaction to acquire the resource, and I'm not sure. Sorry, I think Mike thinks I'm dropping out, so I'm not sure if I am or not. But I guess my second point is it implies that we can only control via a transaction, and is that what we really mean?
Edwin, do you want to just respond, because I think that's a good point that Lynn's making.
Yeah, so I guess it's not necessarily a transaction, but it also could be some sort of event, like, for example, having legislation in place. And I guess I didn't really want to get into that in this introductory chapter. So I can see if we can add something in here that's generic without actually going into each of the resources. But I guess in the context of past event, most of the time it would be a transaction, but in the framework, it's pretty clear that it doesn't really have to be. So I can add more meat around this to explain it.
I mean, just back on that, Edwin, I mean, is this not where sovereign powers comes into play? Because actually that wouldn't be a transaction in Lynn's example. It would be where we've actually brought in legislation, which then means that you do have you do potentially have an asset. Right. So I think we just need to sort of tease that out. And I think certainly understand the point that you were making, Lynn, about developing the resource I don't think applies there. I think it's either the sovereign powers thing, so that it suddenly becomes an asset, or probably there is a transaction. Does that seem right? So perhaps, Edwin, if you can have a look at that, I think that may be something, have a look at that and see where we get to on that. I think we need to be, it's quite an important point, and it may even be that you just want to have a discussion with the task force on that specific point, just to make sure that we've got that clear. So I've got Lucy, and then Renee, and then I'll go back to Thomas.
Yes, thank you, Chair. My comment is on 2.8. We made reference to 5.12 of the conceptual framework. So we listed there 2.88D. However, I noticed that we dropped the last paragraph in 5.12, quoted as, while these indicators are not conclusive determinants of whether control exists, identification and analysis of them can inform that decision. I think we can also consider that in 2.8, since this 8D may not be the the only determinants to determine control. Thank you.
Edwin, do you want to respond immediately, or is that something that would be better taken offline with Lucy?
Yeah, I can reach out to Lucy. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll take Renee, and then I'm going to go to Thomas and then to Mike. Renee.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. My comment was exactly where Lynn went on paragraph 211. There are other types of transactions. For example, and Edwin, for your consideration in thinking about this further, it could be through inheritance. It could be through treaty, conquest, expropriations, legislation. So there are different ways. I think if we can just try to tease out, as you said, Chair, those other types, I think those examples are good ones.
Thanks, Renee. Yes. Conquest one was an interesting one, but you're right. I hadn't thought about that. So if I can go to Thomas and then to Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I want to come back to my earlier comment, and actually I have a much bigger problem with 2.11, even if I agree with everything what has been said. But I think 2.11 brings together two issues which have no logical connectivity, and one is human intervention, and the second is the transaction, because human intervention is changing its state. And that has no relationship to acquisition, non-exchange, exchange. You can acquire a forest without changing its state, without human intervention. So when I started reading 2.11, natural resources are resources which have not yet been subjected to human intervention. Therefore, it is possible for an entity to gain control. I thought, okay, now it comes. It's possible to gain control without human intervention, but then it's making the change or the shift to acquisition, which for me doesn't make any sense because it's not connected to each other.
So I think, what I'm hearing from members is concerns around that we haven't really quite bottomed what the past event actually is. And I think the, clearly that point that Thomas has just articulated, but I think it was also, maybe it was Lynn's points as well. I think, it clearly bringing in reference to human intervention here doesn't actually help. What we need to do is actually discuss the types of transactions and routes, and Renee gave a very good summary of those. So I think, Edwin, if we can go back and have a look at that and recast these in that sense, I think that'd be helpful. Lindy, I just want to check with you as Task Force Chair, are you happy that with that sense of direction?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is right.
Yeah. Okay, good. So thanks, everyone. I think we've now got a clearer direction on that past event section. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So I had a question on 212 and 214. So in 212, we say that control is the key consideration, and I'm just wondering if we all agree that it is in fact the key, or is it a key consideration? I'm getting into words here, but to me it's important because control is important, but so is the past event. So I just wanted to make sure we agree that it's the or a. And then in paragraph 214, we close the sentence by saying would be no requirement to recognize or disclose. Maybe that should be or present. But have we already decided that there would be no requirement to disclose? I'm not sure that we have, because there may be circumstances where we say the item doesn't meet the definition of an asset, but we want to encourage disclosure or presentation or something that tells the reader what's going on with that particular item.
Thanks, Mike. I think that is a good spot, and I see thumbs up that we should address that. I think probably on that 212 to 214, the instruction there is actually to make sure that we are in line with the commentary in the framework. And then I think we also do need to bring in that reference to presentation. Ross, are you on that?
Yeah, maybe just to address Mike's comment, maybe we're just closing things off a little too quick here. We're going to have the specific chapters that look at these issues in more detail. So maybe we just say the recognition, measurement, disclosure be revisited in the following chapters. Again, I think we probably shouldn't jump into those issues too quickly, and we are going to have to look at those by topic.
Okay, thanks for that summary, Ross. I think members are reacting positively to that. So if Edwin, you're okay, then just to sort the wording out in that way. So Mike, you sort of slightly stepped ahead there, but I think, so if I just take comments then, assuming there's nothing else anybody wants to bring up on 212 to 214 with that, I'll move on then to existence, uncertainty and asset recognition, which is 215 through to 219. Yeah, David.
Thank you, Chair. I always wonder why a sentence starts with "in other words," which is what we've got in paragraph 216. That suggests to me that we haven't explained ourselves very well in the preceding sentence or sentences. So I think that of itself would mean that that paragraph needs to be rethought, because I don't think the sentence starting with "in other words" gives me any clarity on what the previous sentence might have said anyway. So I think it needs to be looked at, as I say. Is 217 necessary? It's actually talking about what the IPSASB came to decided when it was looking at the conceptual framework, and I think if it is appropriate, or some of it's appropriate, then I think it needs to be looked at in terms of the way it's written. And then in 218, again, I'm not quite sure what that's getting at. So I'm not very happy with that section, I suppose, is my summary.
Okay, so I think taking those points in order, then clearly there is the question about whether we still need that sentence in 216. In other words, whether there's anything that needs to come back in. There's the question about paragraph 2.17, either we can delete it, or if we do need it, then it needs to be, made more specific in the context of the argument here. And I think there's also David's point on 218. So perhaps if you can work those through with him, Edwin. Okay, Lucy, next.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to go to 2.18 where I suggest changing the question that needs to be addressed in connection with the characteristics of resources. As provided in paragraph 5.7 of the conceptual framework, physical form is not a necessary condition of a resource. So the question of existence may not be consistent with the definition provided in the conceptual framework. So maybe the proper question that whether or not the resource can generate economic benefits or has a service potential that could contribute in achieving the entity's objectives. So perhaps 2.18 may be rephrased or revised as in incorporating this. So the conceptual framework's basis for conclusion explains that when determining if an item meets the definition of an asset, there could be uncertainty over whether a resource presently can generate economic benefit or has a service potential, rather than the existence. And then we continue on uncertainty over whether the entity controls the resource, or uncertainty over the existence of a past event giving rise to control. So we retain the last sentence. So instead of we have to include the phrase whether a resource presently can generate economic benefit or health service potential. Thank you, Chair.
And any immediate comments on what Lucy said? I mean, clearly, you know, the drafting does need a look at in line with the comments that Lucy's made, but also with David's concerns.
Yeah, I can work those in. I think the intention for 17 was really just saying that there is no set probability threshold when deciding whether something exists. And the 218 was really saying when you're thinking about existence uncertainty, you have to think about all aspects of the asset definition. So I can work with both Lucy and David to come up with better drafting for this.
Okay, thanks for that. So let's move on then to the section on capable of being measured in a way that achieves the QCs and constraints. So I'm on paras 220 through, well, let's just do the page by page on this. So I'm on the section beginning 220 on page 14 through to 224 there. David.
Thank you, Chair. In 224, is it 224? Yeah, I just wonder whether some of this ought to be in the chapter on the particular natural resources that we're considering, because it seems to be jumping ahead.
Should we consider that in the context of that piece of work that's going to be done responding to the types of transactions and so on, because it either may not be necessary or 224 may need to be revised for that? Okay, so if we can leave you with that instruction, Edwin. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So as you go through considering what you've just said to David, I mean, I found some of this information in chapter 2 repeats itself again in 3, 4, and 5. But in the end, that didn't worry me because this is a CP, it's not an ED. So I didn't mind if there was a bit of repetition. So that's my view, is it can be comfortably in all of those places. And in 224 more specifically, I was worried about the second last line where we say historical cost measure would not reflect the economic benefit. And in the next sentence, we say, therefore, unlikely that historical cost. I'd rather be softer in both places and say historical cost might not reflect, so that we're being consistent between the two sentences.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So we need to sort that out there. Okay. So moving on then to the next page, paras 225 through to 232. Comments on that? Mike, are you still in, or no? Okay. David.
No, thanks, Chair. I would just, can we add those paragraphs to the instruction that you gave before, because I think it links into what Mike and I've already said about needing to be careful about how we link them into following chapters. And again, I think some of it seems to preempt discussions that we're going to have in the specific chapters, and could actually raise expectations early on that we might not be fulfilling later.
Okay, so I think that's generalizing out that comment. Although I think Mike makes a good comment as well, that there's no harm in raising a general principle, and actually that may well be right, because this is a CP rather than the standard, but we need to be careful about specifics at this stage, because those will come up in subsequent chapters. Okay, so that's a general comment, I think, on this whole section, isn't it, David? Any other points anybody wanted to raise on page 15? So So let's move on then through to the remainder of that section, which is the top of page 16. So we're through to 234 here. Mike.
Chair, I'm on 233, and I'm just wondering whether the final sentence is needed. In many cases, the natural resource will likely be material due to the quantity and value. I'm just not sure why we need to say that.
I agree with you. I think so. We delete that sentence. Thanks for that, Mike. Good spot. Okay, so section on measurement uncertainty then. So the first paragraphs here are 235 through to 237. Any points on those? Then we go to general measurement principles, which starts at 238. Lucy.
Yes, Chair. Can we go back to 2.36? Since we agreed, that on the definition of natural resource as naturally occurring and in its natural state, therefore it becomes vulnerable to natural causes of depletion. And considering this, I would like to suggest that we include also natural depletion as one of the factors that should be disclosed under measurement uncertainty. An example of this, of natural depletion, is pollution or contamination and soil erosion. Now, with regard also to the natural causes of depletion, there is a question whether activities that are relating to replenishment or restoration of these of natural resources would be considered as human intervention. So in that case, I suggest that there will be a 2C, 2.36C.
Edwin, back on that. My immediate reaction is I think you're kind of raising a separate point to the one that's being made here, Edwin.
Yeah, well, let me work offline with Leslie to see exactly what she wants to add in. But I do agree, like, I think A and B is really just explaining why we can't reliably measure the item. So yeah, I'm not sure if that would be a separate point, I think.
I mean, I think the point you're raising in terms of the expenditure made, actually, that's a separate area that we're going to have to make sure we discuss in terms of conservation, preservation, and so on. But I don't think that comes in here, Lucy.
Okay, so we'll just find a way where we can include or disclose also the causes of natural depletion.
Yeah, so Edwin, if you can work with Lucy on that, because it is an important point, and the question I think is whether it goes in general here or whether we deal with it better in, for example, the chapter on living resources, maybe. Okay.
Yes,
so
I will work with Edwin on this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. So I've got Lynn and then David.
So my point was on para 240. I've concluded in my own thinking that we should delete the paragraph. We don't know where ED measurement will be by the time we publish this, and it's actually not needed.
Thanks, Lynn. Anybody fight in its defence? I think that's right. Okay, I see some thumbs up on that. So 240 goes. So to David then.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to pick up on 236 actually. I mean, I can see that this has come from the consideration we had when we were discussing heritage assets. or heritage items under ED 78. But I wasn't sure that the paragraph, if we can reference it, perhaps more closely to the discussion we had on for heritage and ED 78, because I'm not convinced that we would be talking about in rare instances here necessarily, and I wasn't aware that in such situations the IPSASB is considering non-financial disclosures similar to what we've done in ED 78. It sounds as if we've got another project on the go, so maybe sort of picking up on some of the points that Lucy and Edwin are going to be working on, maybe they could take that into consideration at the same time.
Okay, thanks, David. Okay, so I think then we're really into the application of general measurement principles 241, 242. Okay, so I think we've had a good walk through those revised chapters 1 and 2. You know, specific comments there, Edwin, to pick up in terms of the instructions to take forward. So we will see this back in September, but just so that members are clear, the changes that have been made, and what I'd like to do at that stage then is also go back to the PVs so that we've got the drafting sorted, and then we can look at the PVs and make sure we're content with those, that they flow, and that the board is content with those. Lynn, and then Mike.
Yeah, so I had 2 comments on the PVs. They both related to disclosure. In B, we seem to be limiting ourselves to non-financial disclosure, but I don't think we should. I think we might consider financial disclosure. We might consider a range of values. That's a financial disclosure. And in C, I think we picked the point up earlier, which will flow through here, which is this is saying that no disclosure would be required, and I think we've already picked up the point earlier that we didn't think that that would necessarily be the case. That was shutting it down too early. So I think disclosure needs to be looked at in B and C.
Thanks. Then I mean, I think we're going to need to think about C quite carefully, because there is a principle which is that we need to be very careful not to just say, well, everything needs disclosure. And so I think we need to have a look at C in particular. You know, so, but I agree those two go together. So we need to have a look at those. Mike.
Yeah, just supporting Lynn. I mean, I think C does worry me because I don't think we've made that call yet. And certainly we didn't make that call in heritage. We said that some disclosure needs to be made where you've decided you're not going to recognise an asset. I know heritage assets are not the same as these sorts of assets, but I don't think we should rule it out.
Okay, so I think that underlines we're going to have a specific discussion, but equally, I think we do have to put some boundaries here around, because otherwise there is a everything requires disclosure. So I think you're right to refer us to that point, Mike, but that's a very specific point in respect of items that we've subsequently recognised, but haven't been recognised up until now. So we just need to be very careful that we're not trying to expand the scope of what's proposed in ED 78 such that we end up with stuff that's unworkable here. And I think that very much goes to some of the discussions that came up in the CAG, around rivers and all kinds of stuff. So that's why I think that bit is very important. And that's really why I'd like us to come back to the PVs and make sure we've got the rest of the drafting right. Then we can see, does that actually really support those PVs? Have we had the right discussions? Lindy, back to you.
Thanks. And I think we must be careful here, because if we don't have an asset because of existence uncertainty, we don't have an asset, then I don't even think the conceptual framework wants disclosure. And I don't think we want to create a precedent here that, if we don't have an asset, we would want additional disclosures, whereas I don't think we would do it anywhere else, even for heritage. But I do think we need to just look at this more carefully and explain specifically what we are asking and what we're concluding on. But we need to be careful not to include something that we wouldn't even do because the conceptual framework doesn't want it either.
Okay. I mean, that does suggest that actually that's something that does require specifically looking at. And I think we do need to look at it in the context, as Mike's raised, in terms of EV78, but also in terms of the point that you've raised. And it's making me think there may be some additional drafting that has to go in here to get us through. Final comments, Mike and Todd.
Yeah, so thanks, Lindy. I think to me you're right, and then it's a messaging thing. We don't want to raise expectations here.
Thanks, Mike. Todd.
Thanks, Ian. I just wanted to make the point, I think in ED78, when we were talking about the disclosures that we wanted for heritage items, what we were talking about there were items that met the definition of an asset that weren't measurable, I think, was where we got to in terms of those disclosures, which is different to what we're saying in preliminary view 2, part C, which is where they don't actually meet the definition of an asset. So I support what you were saying, Chair, earlier.
Thanks, Todd. Renee, and I see from other members. Renee.
Yes, thank you, Chair. In PV2, we looked at the word is certain and is either uncertain. So the references to certain and uncertain in A, B, and C, they are creating confusion. For example, in A, are we talking about existence or measurement uncertainty? Maybe we want to clarify what is uncertain here in A. And then in B, if the natural resource meets the definition of an asset, then whether it's uncertain and or cannot be measured reliably, uncertain must be measurement uncertainty here, not existence. So it seems like that part of the sentence is duplicating with the rest. And so I think we should look at these words to make sure the logic holds together.
Okay, thanks, Renee. I think others agree with you on that. So I think, kind of I think basically both PV1 and PV2 need detailed review before we see them. But, perhaps Renee, and other members who have specific comments as drafted at the moment can pass those over to Edwin so he can work on those. Good. Okay, so with that, we're through chapters 1 and 2. As I say, we'll see the edits to those and we'll focus on the PVs in September when we see this back. Now, Edwin, I think you just wanted to get any general comments that members had on the proposed structure of the other chapters. So I don't know if you want to introduce anything on that.
I guess I'll just quickly talk to it, and it's in Appendix A of the paper, so starting on page 13 of the PDF. So all we want here is, well, obviously the chapters have not been drafted yet, so it's not a detailed discussion. We just want to get members' reactions and any high-level comments that they have at this time for the proposals.
Okay. Thanks, Edwin. So just, chapter by chapter, if there's anything anybody, kind of had a problem with. Chapter 3, subsoil resources. Any comments on that? And then it's proposing that we just flip the order originally we were working to bring water in next, really because there are some commonalities in terms of the issues, and that we dealt with living resources as chapter 5. So anything on the outline in terms of water? And similarly, living resources. And then there are some sort of indications of kind of coverage in chapter 6 on presentation, but that's really the area that we haven't discussed. And I think Mike has quite rightly been flagging that all the way through, because that's going to be really important. And that's where the interface with sustainability reporting potentially comes in and so on. Ajith.
Thanks, Ian. In chapter 5, living resources, there was on the living resources outside the scope of the project. Item referred to there is item subject to biological transformation, account for using IPSAS 27 agriculture. I think words item subject to biological transformation is not appropriate, I think, because it should be agricultural activity, I believe, because the agricultural activity defined under IPSAS 27 agriculture. Biological transformation is a wider term, which is part of the description of the agricultural activity. So I think the word agricultural activity might be more appropriate there. Just a small comment.
Okay, thanks, Ajith. Edwin, you can pick that up. Yep. Okay. Patricia.
Yes, thank you. My question is connected with the early discussion about the uncertainty, because I think maybe fleet uncertain is the part of the definition of assets make clear, because I ask about the definition and then I ask about uncertainty. Maybe to connect the 2 points, I think it's better when I see the structure of the capture. Other point I think is strange to me. It's a water resource outside or living resource outside, and subsoil resource. I think it's not about the natural resource, but about the other assets or other expenses, expenditures. And in my view, I think it's necessary to connect with the discussion about the assets and activities control and assets control. I think it's, but here it's not about natural resource outside, but other assets related to natural resource. It's my point. Thank you.
Edwin, do you want to come back on that? Because I think you're right, Patricia. The really important thing here is going to be that a lot of things will not be recognised in natural resources, but we need to make sure that they are appropriately dealt with in other standards. Edwin?
Yeah, I think it might be better to just rephrase those headings as assets from activities relating to, and then the resource. So yeah, I agree with Patricia that the wording is probably incorrect right now. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thomas, final comments, and then I'm going to wrap up.
Yeah, just coming back to your explanation of changing the order of the chapters, it might sound a little bit like a bean counter. I can understand what you were saying, but then I would suggest to kind of change the order in all other paragraphs as well. 1.8, 2.5, we always have the order kind of a subsoil, living, water, that we kind of just for the flow of the reading, we change the order as well. Sorry for that. It might be nitty-gritty, but for me,
you're right. It's all about rinsing all of these changes. Yeah. So thanks, Thomas. Yeah, and I see thumbs up from various people on that. Good. Okay. So I think that's been a good session. I think thank you, Edwin, for the work that you've done on these chapters. I think that's really sharpened them up. We've had a good discussion as a result of that, and I think our constituents will appreciate that. So thank you for that. We'll look forward to seeing the updated drafting on the 3 chapters in accordance with the plan, and then also for a first discussion on presentation in the September meeting. Anything else you want to raise with us in the session today?
Not at this point, no.
Okay, that's good. So thanks everyone. Good first session. So I think we break now for 10 minutes and then we come back and we will move on to our first discussion on the responses to the leases ED. So back at past, please. And David, if you can, as ever, keep time for us.
1 minute warning.
Okay, so we can move into the session on leases. Just to say, we've had a note from Mark to say he's been having network problems, and it looks like he's not going to be able to make it to the meeting today. So that's why we haven't seen him. Just before we actually really kick off on leases, I wanted to just say that we, as will be obvious in a minute, we have a change of task force chair on leases, and Lynn has very nobly stepped up to take on this very tricky topic. So Lynn, thank you very much for taking on that role. And the reason why we've made that change is actually not that we want to lose Mike as chair of the leases task force, because he, I really want to recognise the fantastic job that you've done, Mike, on leases. I think you put a huge amount of effort into that, and it's a real tribute to your leadership that we got to where we got to ED75. It's only a reflection of the fact that sadly you finish your term on the board at the end of the year and now seem the reasonable time to make that change. But Mike, I just want to make sure that we really do recognise how much work you put in and your tremendous contribution on this. So thank you very much for that. And I think with that, shall perhaps hand over to you just for some introductory words, and then I think we're going to hear from Lynn.
Yes, thank you, Ian. I'm going to just share the initial slide to locate the board where we are in. So we are in the agenda item 2, lists, and before starting the specific agenda items that the staff brings to this session, staff thought that it would be useful for Lynn, as the new task force chair, to provide a report back to the IPSASB on the current status of the project and the next steps, ahead of what we are intending to go with this project. And before passing the word to Lynn, I would like to echo Ian's words and from staff to provide a big word of appreciation and a thank you for Mike for his leadership in the task force, as he's stepping down from the task force chair. So, and with this, I'll stop sharing my screen and pass the floor to Lynn. Thank you.
Thanks, Joelle. So I haven't got much to add. I wanted to say thanks to Mike as well, and he'll sorely be missed from our future discussions, no doubt. But we're yet to determine the task force members, Mike, so we might be able to tap you on the shoulder yet to continue. So what we've done in the papers is to try to give you an overview of the project direction. Clearly, the board made a very important decision when it approved the ED for issue, and in doing so, adopted the IFRS 16 model around lessee and lessor accounting. And I think it's an important discussion that we will have today about whether or not we wish to reaffirm that position. And we really do need that steer from the board in order for us to then consider the RFI, and the responses to that, which is a stream of work that we will need to undertake over the next few months. And so it's really an important discussion today and to get that steer from the board, because it will have an impact on the next part of the work programme. But what you can see, without preempting any discussions, is that there has been a good response and good support. So I really look forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Lynn. And I echo what you say in terms of, I think there has been a very good range of responses, very interesting range of responses to support our deliberations. And without further ado, João, move back to you.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to share the screen. Before introducing the items, staff thought that it would be useful to provide at this session a brief history of the LISIS project, because it has been quite a while that we are doing this project, but also especially for the new board members that entered this year, for them to have a better understanding of how we started, how we developed until we got until ED75. So this project started back into June 2016, so 5 years ago. At that time, we developed what it will be approved in December 2017, the exposure draft 64. So the CAG was also consulted at the time. After that, there was a review of responses that took almost 1 year. And in March of 2020, after the consultation also with the CAG, the board took a very important strategic decision that led to the development of the ED75 as we have it now. And we got that approval back in December 2020 and published earlier this year in January. We got the standard out and responded at the time to provide their comments until the end of May, some late responses into June, which led the staff only to bring this item in the check-in meeting. This is the history of the project that we have so far, which sets the scene for what staff is bringing to the board. So with this, Ian, I don't know if you want to say a few words before stepping in, or shall I continue?
No, I think that's clear, João. Mike, you just wanted to come in on that, and I'll just check whether there are any questions or anything that members have before we move off into the detailed discussion. So João, if you can stop sharing your screen and just go to you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I thought I would just remind existing board members and new board members that as part of that consultation process, we also engaged with the GASB and with the chair of the New Zealand board, and we also engaged with representatives from the UK Treasury, and I think it was one of our task force members who presented the sort of private sector experience to us along the way. So it was quite a comprehensive consultation process, not just focusing on responses to the ED.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why you're right to identify that the importance of that strategic discussion that we had in March 2020, because that really was a change from the approach that we adopted in ED64 towards the fully aligned approach, or the fully aligned lessee lessor approach in ED75. Okay, Mike, do you want to add anything else, or are you still? Right, okay. Anybody else got any questions in terms of the overall history? No, okay, good. So back to you, João.
Thank you, Ian. I'll share again the screen. So The next step was what respondents said about the exposure draft 75. So this slide summarizes at a high level that review of responses. So staff thought it would be useful to present to the board the characteristics of the constituents that respond to ED 75, because there is some very interesting insights in that. So we have, in terms of region, Latin America and Caribbean countries and the African Middle East comprising almost half of the comment letters to the exposure draft, which brings quite a big diversity of views in terms not only of the views, of the nature of the views itself, but of the quantity of those views, which is really interesting. And I think it proves to the fact that this is really a global standard that we are proposing, and our constituents are involved. The second insight, it's about the function of those constituents. As you can see here in this slide, we have preparers and member or regional bodies as overwhelming respondents to this consultation, which speaks to the fact that who are responding to our consultations are the entities that are applying our proposed standards and standards when they are finally approved, which is really great because they have a chance, and they do that to provide their voice into the shaping of our standards. In terms of languages, what we have is the non-English speaking countries providing quite substantive comments to these consultation, which also I would say encompasses what the insights that we got from region and function. And with this, I'd like, I don't know if Ian or Ross wants to say anything on the nature of these comment letters before going to.
No, other than I do think that is tremendously encouraging, and I would say, in my experience, I think that actually is the most diverse set of responses that we've had, both in terms of geography, but I'm also very encouraged that at the level of responses from non-English speaking jurisdictions. I think that's a very positive trend. And I think that speaks a lot to the engagement of individual board members and the board through regional roundtables, as well as global implementation trends. So I think that is important to recognise. Ross, did you want to comment before we go back to Joe?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think the one thing that I'd like to highlight is we are seeing a positive uptick, starting with the revenue transfer expenses responses in the number of responses overall. And I did want to specifically thank and highlight the FOCAL group that has really helped us with the Latin American engagement, and Camira, who unfortunately is not here today, has been central in that, in working with FOCAL and making sure that they have the ability to respond and pull together those various groups to input on our consultation. That's really important, and that's really driving that growth that Joao's shown us in Latin America in particular, but in other regions, is working with those organizations like FOCAL. So it's just really important to highlight that. So I wanted to know that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's very, we're getting very good engagement, and indeed we've had Ross and I have had a meeting with the new chair of FOCAL just recently, so it's very positive. So thanks everyone on that, particularly Camira, work she's been putting in recently. Joao, over to you.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Ian. So jumping into the specific SMCs that were put into the exposure draft to seek the constituents' views on the several SMCs that were there. So the first okay, the first one is related to Okay, to the SMC1, and here staff thought it would be useful to provide this clarification. So as you all know, SMC1 was quite a generic SMC, seeking the views from constituents on the adaptation of IFRS 16 to the public sector as proposed in the ED 75. But what it was interesting from the respondents is that respondents splitted that SMC basically in three parts: commenting on lessee accounting, commenting on lessor accounting, and whether agreeing or not with lessee and lessor accounting, they provided additional comments in other parts of the ED 75. Because of this structure, the way that the respondents commented to ED 75, staff thought it would be more useful to also split the SMC according to what constituents split. And that's why SMC now, staff is only addressing the lessee and lessor accounting models, which can be seen here in these two graphs. Basically, we have overall support to going forward. But of course, some constituents raise some miscellaneous issues related to ED 75, but still supporting the main proposals for the lessee right of use model and the lessor risks and rewards model. Then the something, sorry. Okay. Then the SMC2, we asked them whether we should include the fair value definition that it was in IFRS 16, which basically retains the same definition of fair value that existed in the IS 17 and in ours IPSAS 13, from which IPSAS 13 is drawn from IS 17 also. So basically, no change in terms of the status of that definition. What we got is we have a majority support. As you can see, 75% of the respondents agreed basically with that approach, providing the very same reasons that it was in the basis for conclusions. But we have quite a significant minority in disagreement and providing, I would say, almost opposing arguments not to proceed with that approach, but instead to bring the ED 75, ED 77 definition of fair value that it is in the measurement project into the leases standard. So for sorry, I'm having problems with with moving the slides. So, and we have a third and the last SMC, basically asking constituents whether we should add the term service potential when economic benefits is also mentioned in the standard. We have overall support. We have even some respondents suggesting to expand the usage of the service potential into other parts of the standard, which staff also brings to this session for the board to discuss. So all in all, this is a very much supported exposure draft that I think leaves the board in a good place to move forward with this standard, proposed standard. Of course, there are still some issues to be addressed, but I will talk about those later. And before going into the agenda item, the first one, I'd like to know if Ian wants to comment, Ian, or shall I proceed?
No, I think go into the items, Joao. I think that's a very helpful overview there.
Okay, thank you, Ian. So the first agenda item 2.2.1, so pages 6 to 9 of the PDF. Now, this agenda item basically provides in more detail the review of responses, focusing once again on the lessee and lessor accounting models proposed, and also seeks some project direction going forward. So, as I said before, there was overall support. for the lessee accounting model and for the lessor accounting model that we have in 75. There were some miscellaneous issues raised that we'll discuss later. Even the issues that were raised by some respondents, basically, there is no new thinking from what it was that the board did not discuss before. So all these led staff to basically recommend, and the IPSASB task force chair, or to recommend the board to proceed with the ED75. Of course, subject to addressing the issues identified in the Appendix V of this agenda item, because there is a strong support for ED75. I should highlight in here that many respondents changed their views between ED64 into ED75. So the ones that supported before ED64 lessor accounting, they now support what we have proposed because of the reasons that it were explained in the basis for conclusions of ED75. The issues raised by respondents that disagree with the ED77, with the ED75, as it is in the Appendix A, are not public sector specific that warrant departure from IFRS 16 or were considered by the IPSASB during the development of ED75 and set out in the basis for conclusion. So there is no new things that the constituents raised that the board had not already considered when developing ED75. So with this, I ask the board if it agrees with this recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, João. And basically the proposal then is that we move ahead, but there will be further staff papers on the topics in Appendix B once we've taken that overall decision. And I think Lynn rightly highlighted the important strategic nature of this decision. So can I open up for board member comments? Perhaps, Lynn, is there anything else you want to add before we open the general discussion? No, okay. So open for comments on that proposal. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So I support staff's and the chair's recommendation. I just wondered whether João or Lynn, does that mean we just need to beef up any of the BCs, but they're okay as they are?
Mike, do you mean the BCs in terms of the overall decision, the strategic decision?
No, it was more a case of João said that some constituents came back with some points of view. If we've already considered those points of view or wanted to re-emphasize something, I just wondered whether we shouldn't think about those in finalising the BCs.
So you're thinking about the issues listed in Appendix A?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Ross, perhaps you could just advise from a generic perspective, please, in terms of how we would approach that.
Yeah, thanks. Well, once the board decides to move forward on this and we address the specific issues, we'll update the BCs as necessary. So we'll have to bring it back with the updated guidance for the board to look at.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Todd, I think you were indicating support for the overall direction. Anybody disagree with the recommendation that we move forward on the basis of ED75? Good. Okay. Well, I think that's unanimous amongst the board members present, which is also a quorum of the board. So thank you very much for that decision. So in line with Mike's intervention, then we will need to see a paper back which discusses potential changes to the BCs, responding to points from constituents, and then we will start to work our way through the list of issues that are outlined in Appendix B. Good. Okay, so João, I think move us on to the next paper then, please. Oh, sorry, Lindy.
Thank you very much. And just it's on a response that we provided in Annex A or Appendix A and the whole GFS matter and the public debt, etc. I know when the IPSASB issued IFRS 16, they did a lot of communication on the impact of the additional liabilities for investors to understand. And I wondered if it would be something that we would also have to do as part of an external communication, just saying, what the impact would be and maybe touching on the links, or, the impacts or the links to the GFS, etc. So that's just something, outside of this that I think would also be important to accompany the final standard. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. I think perhaps what I'd suggest we do is, João, I know you're going to, in September, give an update on the updates of the international standards as statistical standards, and that issue is certainly prevalent there. So perhaps we can come back to that, Lindy, in terms of how we address that. Thomas.
Yeah, as we are talking about the responses to comments made, just regarding one comment made by respondent 1 and 23, which is the first box, number C, where kind of the comment was that the underlying asset is recognized neither in lessors nor in the lessee's financial statements. As I remember, that was one of the major objectives when the ISB started its project to kind of avoid these situations. And we, as much as I understand, staff is not really giving an answer to that. It's kind of answering to the symmetry of accounting, but it's not answering this aspect. And I think it's really important to give a good answer to that. It's not a consolidation issue. It's an issue of whether it appears on the balance sheet, whether single financial statements or consolidated financial statements at all.
Thanks, Thomas. I think we should reference back to our, you're right, it is an extremely important point. I think we should reference back to what's already in the basis for conclusions in responding to that. Because I think we did put a lot of thought into explaining the very...
I agree.
Yeah, thanks. Ross, did you want to come in on that before I go to Lisbeth?
Just quickly, because I think to your point, Ian, I think that was the whole rationale behind ED64. So the board had considered that. We proposed it. We went through the responses, and then we had to go in another direction. So I think we just got to bring that context into our response to this. We're not, we've decided to go back to the IFRS 16 model, and I don't think, we can keep going around it. So I think just bringing the context that we have considered that in ED64. That was the main reason for our departure for lessor accounting in that proposed standard, and that because of those responses to that, we've reverted back to IFRS 16.
Thanks, Ross. Lisbeth.
Thank you, Chair. On the comment, on the staff comment on 23, Appendix A, for responses, respondent 1 and 23, specifically on letter B, accounting symmetry between lessee and lessor, and then the underlying assets on letter C. It was mentioned that at consolidation level, all transactions will be eliminated. And then there is we actually prepared illustrative accounting entries to prove this, whether this is tenable. So the accounting entries from the accounting entries that we drawn, that all transactions will be eliminated may not always be true. So we can send to João the accounting entries that we did. And to be more specific, we may say that all lease-related transactions will be eliminated. Because of this, I suggest that maybe there should be an IG to be included, or a statement that in consolidated FS, all lease-related transactions of consolidated entities should be eliminated. And here, the eliminations may also be very challenging if there are lease transactions with other entities that are outside outside or means in public private sector, and the accounts were not properly identified as within the consolidated entity. So I think we have to revisit the comment, the staff comment on B and C. I can share with you the accounting entries that we did, and it disproved the accounting entries that we did disproved the comment of the staff. So thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Lucy. So I think there's probably two things come out of your comments. One is obviously, getting the wording right in terms of the reasoning that we put into the BCs. But I think secondly, more importantly, actually, is beginning to formulate our views on what guidance will need to go with the what will be a new IPSAS. And I think it would be useful to have some staff thinking on that if we can, because clearly this is a big change. We know that a lot of work was put into this when the ISB issued the standard. They had their transition working group afterwards. I think we've got a lot of experience already in terms of through the UK Treasury input into the task force on how you can make this work for a government consolidation. You're also offering experience there, Lucy. So I think if that's okay, if we can ask staff as one of the deliverables, this may not be September, this may be later, but I think we need to start to think about that. What will we have by way of education material? Do we need something else, going forwards? So I think if we can ask staff to take that away. So thanks very much for making that point, Lucy. Okay, so João, lead us into the next item then, please.
Yes, thank you, and thank you to the board for the very useful comments. So as Ian said, I'll bring back later the proposed change, and we will engage with the relevant board members. So I'm going to share my screen to move to the next agenda item. So the agenda item 2.2.2 in page 10 to 12 of the issues paper. So we ask the constituents in SMC3 about the adding the term service potential after economic benefits when referring to the underlying asset. Basically, we have overwhelming support to do that. We even received the suggestions to expand that the usage of service potential in other paragraphs of the standard and other sections of the standard. So that expansion is explained in Appendix A to this agenda item. So basically, what staff recommends the board is to proceed with the proposals in ED 75 and include the term service potential in addition to economic benefits where appropriate when identifying a lease, because it was supported by respondents. And so what I ask the board on an exception basis, because that expansion is provided in Appendix A, if the board also agrees with the staff and the task force recommendation on the going forward. So staff asks the board whether it disagrees with this recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, João. So I just want to check in terms of the overall direction, including service potential as supported by our constituents. Does anybody disagree with that? We'll pick up the comments on the proposed additions in terms of the examples separately, but in terms of the overall proposal, anybody disagree? So I've got Patricia, are you on the detail?
Not a detail, but it's a more general concept in relation to the change in the examples. But I think it's not, I understand it's there after that moment.
Okay.
But I have one question here. The service potential is an issue of the conceptual framework project. The timeline, I think the moment that the change will be in the conceptual framework is after that the issue of the leases standard. Then I think it's necessary to consider the change, but I understand that it will be after when we discuss the conceptual framework. Is that?
So I think in terms of the conceptual framework work, it is a limited scope update. So we're not removing the concept of service potential nor making significant changes to the concept of service potential. We do have that issue that we're looking at in terms of the explanation around service potential. And you're right, there is a bearing in terms of using the term here, but it's not a significant change, it's a clarification I think we're looking at. Ross, can you help us out then in terms of timelines?
Yeah, I think my point was along your line, Ian. I think we're looking at that clarification related to service potential, but I don't think that changes the use of service potential in relation to leases and what was proposed here, which is based on what's in the current framework. And again, I would point to the overwhelming support we got from constituents on what was proposed and how we've used it. And I think this is a pretty easy one to say, yeah, agree, move on. And I think there's other issues to focus on. I think this is pretty clear cut.
Thanks, Ross. Lindy, are you on this as well? Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to use Ross's words, yeah, I agree and move on. But I just wanted to just emphasize that we must make sure in the BCs that it's quite clear what the principle is that drove the inclusion in specific places, because we wouldn't want to get to this point where, you have arguments with auditors on, oh no, it was a mistake or not. So it's just to make sure that we're clear in the BCs, and that would be, yeah, to support that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the overall approach, then I think we've got support from the board for moving ahead with the inclusion of service potential in the areas proposed in ED 75. We then need to just discuss, I think, whether there are any specific points of principle people want to bring up on the list of proposed additions in 2.2, recognizing that a lot of this is actually non-authoritative material rather than authoritative. So I'm just looking for any specific concerns that people have. Yes, Mike.
So I agree with what you just said, Chair, but I just wondered, I haven't gone back and read every one of the examples. So example 6A, for example, on page 2 of that particular agenda item, where we're talking about adding the word service potential from a ship. If the example itself is only talking about economic benefits, then don't add service potential. I just want us to make sure we've looked at each one to make sure adding service potential is right in the context of the example.
Thanks, Mike. Patricia, and then I'll go to Joanne.
Yes, thank you. My comment is aligned with the Mike. I think it's not only to add the service potential in the text, but analyze the example as a whole. Because I sometimes I think it's the example are not specific for public sector, but okay, it's possible. But I think it's useful if the example be specific for the public sector. For example, chip for car transportation, I think it's not so common. Then chip for national defense or transportation of people, for example. But in other examples, I think it's more complex because, in example 4, example 4 approach the portion of cash flow derived from services sold or provided. And services sold or provided cash for service sold or provided linked to a service potential is more difficult too. Then I think it's necessary to analyze the text as a whole, not only to add the service potential.
Thanks, Patricia. I think you make a good point that we shouldn't just automatically go through and put those in. And I think the challenge you're making is this genuinely a public sector specific issue where service potential is appropriate. Todd, are you on this? I want to go to João and Lynn, I think, afterwards, because I'm thinking that probably there is an exercise here where, you know, certainly I think, Lynn, I'd appreciate, you know, you and João working these through, and in line with Patricia's comment that is this truly a public sector specific case, and that we should, if you like, challenge whether we add in all cases or just those that are where there's a clear public sector rationale. I'll go to Todd, and then perhaps I can just get, Ross, you want to come in?
I was just going to say, I agree with where you're going on this, Ian, and I think it was Mike's point, and kind of supported by Patricia, to not just do it blindly, to make sure that example relates to service potential in some way. You will recall when we proposed DD 75 for approval, from a staff perspective, we were struggling on whether service potential was needed, and we had a question on whether you could actually have a lease that meets the definition of a contract where you're only using the asset for its service potential. And the examples were limited. So I would agree that we should limit where we put it in the actual examples, although the concept is needed in front and supported.
Thanks for that clarification, Ross. Todd, and then I'll just go over to Lynn.
Thanks, Ian. And I agree it's important to look at this in context, but certainly reading Appendix A without the context, I was comfortable with where service potential had been added, because it was talking about service potential in relation to the lessee or the customer. And I think if you've got a public sector entity, and it might have entered into a contract for a lease, what it actually uses that asset for may not be to generate cash flows. So you can get a lot of public sector entities that are there to provide services to customers that might be leasing property to operate from, or all sorts of other things, and they're not actually there to make money out of the reason that they're leasing the asset. They are there to deliver services. So I think, you know, let's have a look at it in context, but I would probably be erring on it is appropriate to talk about service potential when you're talking about it in the context of the customer or the lessee in general.
Thanks, Todd. Lynn, do you want to, I mean, I gave a proposed way forward, making a call on your time. I just wondered, you know, what your thoughts were. I had also listening to the interventions made by other board members. Are you content that that's a reasonable way forward at this stage to, you know, to work through in that way and really challenge the rationale case by case?
So more than happy to do that. We will do that, particularly on the examples, which is where I think members are particularly identifying it, but also recognising Todd's point that I agree with as well. We should make sure that where we're talking about the customer, and the customer is the public sector, that we make that relevant to the public sector as well. But we'll take that away to have a look at on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Thanks then. And thanks everyone for those comments. I think, you know, that it is, as Ross described well, that, you know, the case was made for the, and clearly supported for the changes in the authoritative text, you know, the core text, and now what we need to do is just make sure we reflect through where that is appropriate in each of those contexts. Okay, so move us on to the next item then, João.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, board, for this very useful discussion. So the task force chair and myself will bring some proposals for the next meeting. So I'm going to share my screen. So the next agenda item, it's about the definition of a list. So I think
Wow, your slides don't seem to be working, and I don't think there's a whole lot to introduce. Why don't we just refer to the paper for the introduction?
Looks like we lost João.
So at the moment, I've got a note saying we're oh, okay. I was going to say you need to stop sharing your screens, João.
So I think Joao's Zoom has crashed on him.
Okay, so what we've got is actually the agenda item 2.23 with the recommendation to proceed with the proposal in ED 75 and retain the defined term contract in the definition of a lease, and that we should review that later, dependent on the developments in the revenue project and also part 2 of this project. So can I have comments on whether anybody disagrees with that proposed approach based on what we've heard? So Mike, you wanted to come in.
Chair, not because I don't agree. I do agree, but I just wanted then that messaging will be important. So whenever we finally get to release this, we need to make it clear why we've done what we've done.
Yep, agreed. So that needs to be reflected in BCs. Thomas, you want to come in?
Yeah, just to build on what Mike just said regarding the messaging, I think I was just a little bit confused by the message in the last sentence of BC 41, which is on page 13, saying the IPSASB concluded that the term binding arrangement embraces a wider set and therefore concluded that it should not be used in this standard. If this is the case, then I think what's the purpose of reconsidering it later in kind of after the revenue project? Because that sounds like it will kind of still hold even after the revenue project is being finished.
Thanks, Thomas. So we do need to just have a look at that wording then on that final sentence on BC 41. I think you're right, to make sure it truly explains which way we're going forwards. Patricia.
Yes, my question is in relation to timeline too, because the two projects, the issue the standards is expected to June 2022. Then I think we will solve the question about the contract and buy the rent together with the project of revenue, and not to provoke the amendments. I could understand how to manage the two projects and the change in the two projects. For me, it's not clear.
Thanks, Patricia. It is complex at the moment, you're right. Ross, perhaps you could just give us a top level overview of how staff are proposing to move these forward. because these do interconnect, you're right, and this is a complex issue that we'll need to A, navigate process-wise, and B, communicate to constituents. So Ross, perhaps if I can go to you.
Thanks, Ian, and happy. I think the key thing to keep in mind with both revenue and leases is they are interdependent. So same with the ISB, when they put out IFRS 15 and IFRS 16, these standards will need to have aligned effective dates and will need to come out relatively well together, for lack of a better word. So I think the plan and the timelines on the work program are aligned with having these approved by June 2022. And should we be ahead on approving this leases standard, I think what we would do is approve it and then wait for the actual release and publication to go alongside revenue, so that if there are any changes we need to make or tweaks, we're able to do that. To the point on the definition itself of the contract, it is the aligned IFRS 16 definition, and I think lease arrangements would need to have the elements of a contract. So I think wider binding arrangements as envisioned in leases would not, those that aren't contractual would not be considered leases in this standard or in our IPSAS 13 standard, as is now. I think it is a contractual type of contract. And I mean in substance. It doesn't mean it has to legally be a contract, but it needs to have the three elements of a contract as set out in the application guidance to financial instruments, where we have that substance over form guidance.
Thanks, Ross. Lindy.
Yeah, I was just going to emphasize what Ross said, because it has a link to financial instruments as well. So the three of them tie together. And if we're going to change it, we need to think about the impact. And it could be that some leases would be accounted for in the revenue standard and not in the lease standard, but we'd have to think about that at the later stage.
Yeah, I think so I think when we come back, probably going back to your original point, Patricia, I think we've got a clear way of working through in terms of the development of the final standard. But I think when we come back on effective dates and consequentials and all those kinds of things, we will need something that wraps all of that up in terms of how we're proposing to proceed, both in relation to revenue and financial instruments, but also in relation to phase 2 of this project, of the leases project. Okay. So I think subject to that and to that point from Thomas, then in terms of that sentence in DC 41, we're content with staff recommendations. And then we move on to 2.2.4, concessionary leases. João, you're back with us. Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So Zoom kicked me out of the session completely, and apologies for that. I'm going to share my screen then. Fingers crossed that everything will go well this time. Okay, so we are in agenda item 2.2.4, pages 15 and 16 of the issues paper. So it's about the scope of ED75, so the section of the scope. And this was one of the issues that the constituents also raised to ED75. So just kind of a background, ED75 does not provide an explicit scope exclusion on concessionary leases. So at the time the board discussed this and basically decided that if there should be any scope exclusion or inclusion, This should be addressed in the phase 2 of the leases project, waiting for the RFI process to develop and for us to settle the discussion there. So once again, we had majority support for the ED75 proposal. Basically, many constituents saying that they agreed with the IPSASB's reasons set out in the basis for conclusions. However, some respondents proposed to include an explicit scope exclusion to help prepare us to decide to apply or not ED75 to concessionary leases. So as it is written in the issues papers, the staff and the task force share recommendation is to proceed with the ED75 proposal for basically 4 reasons. So the issues that constituents raised, basically, it's no new thinking to provide that could change the discussions that the board had when developing ED75. So as I said before, this issue will be considered in the phase 2 of the leases project. Perhaps by addressing now, we'll be putting the cart ahead of the horses and might change any decision later on, which gives instability into a recently proposed standard. And the decision is consistent also underlined with the scope of IPSAS 13. So in this case, there is no change in the current status for preparers to applying this new standard, transitioning from IPSAS 13. And of course, this approach is also aligned within the scope of IFRS 16. And we should highlight that concessionary leases, it's not a public sector specific transaction, as they are also in the private sector. We could say that they might be more prevalent in the public sector, but it's not specific. Because of this, staff and the task force recommend the IPSASB to proceed with the proposal and ask the board if it agrees with this recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So open up for comments from members on the proposal to proceed with the ED75 approach. So Mike, you were first and then Todd.
Thanks, Chair. So I'm supportive of what we put in the ED, and that was we wouldn't make an explicit statement about concessionary leases. And then I wondered whether we didn't need to be more clear with our constituents, because we then, if I'm a preparer, I'll look at it and say, well, it's not clear whether I use ED75 or not. I can apply the hierarchy to get me to whatever ED75 is going to finally be in a standard. And then on the other hand, I see we've got a project that's going along that's talking about concessionary leases in an RFI. And I might say to myself, well, I'll just wait to see what happens with the RFI. And with all that sort of thinking running in my mind, I wondered whether an explicit exclusion might not be helpful, or needs to be somehow messaged to so preparers understand where to go looking.
I'm going to take comments from other members first. I think we have to be very careful, though, about trying to do something to exclude concessionary leases, because it's almost impossible to try and to find a way of doing an explicit exclusion. So probably, you know, we need to do something that clarifies. But I think the point is that this is no different to the situation in IPSAS 13. Todd, and then Lindy.
Thank you, Ian. And I think I'm very supportive of the comments that Mike made, because I've been reflecting on this, and I think it is a matter of being clear with our constituents, because right now we've got this proposed ED and we've got the RFI, and without being really clear with what we're expecting in terms of implementing, if this ED becomes a standard, then there's going to be a bit of confusion created, because you get people that will say, well, the standard doesn't exclude concessionary leases, so I need to apply it to them. But then there'll be others that will say, but you've got the second phase of the project, so perhaps you are implicitly excluding them. And I think the key for me is being absolutely clear what we expect of our constituents around concessionary leases once ED75 becomes a standard. Are they meant to be accounted for under it, or are they not? And whether that's by putting an explicit exclusion or having VCs that make it clear for people. Something has to happen to be clear about it in my mind.
Ross, to you.
Yeah, I think it's challenging because I don't know how you could add an explicit exclusion for concessionary leases without defining them, and that's part of the work we have to do in the RFI. So I think we're going to get tied up on this issue. And again, we're having this conversation as if we don't already have this issue with IPSAS 13, which we do, and we've had for several years. So I think just acknowledging it in the BCs, that it's in the RFI portion, and that we're going to look at it is the right approach. And that's why the proposal makes that, because I think we'll get tied up on this issue when what we really need to do is get into it on the RFI. And to do that, we've got to land the model, and that we've got to put ED 75 to bed. So I think it is a challenging issue. The one thing I would note for members is we have noted that this will have to be linked with revenue, and it's likely we will have a longer than usual implementation period. So this standard will have probably at least 2 to 3 years to implement at a minimum. So by the time we do implement, we might have more clarity. And I think as long as we let people know that this issue is ongoing and we're working on it, I think that's really the best we can do. The risk is we start trying to solve this issue now and we stall everything and we don't make the progress we need to make. So I think we've been clear since the beginning that we're going to get the model, land it, and then we're going to move on to the RFI. And I think the board's doing what it said it's going to do.
Okay, thanks, Ross. So I think probably the proposal then is that there is some form of communication that is required. And I think we need to think whether that's in the BCs or whether that's somewhere else. But the way forward will be dependent on what the effective date for the standard is. And, probably in terms of the communication, we should be saying to our constituents, referring them to the fact that concessionary leases will be discussed, will be considered under part 2 of the project, and therefore they should not be at this stage until that guidance becomes clearer, changing any treatment that they've actually already adopted under IPSAS 13. So, that's a slightly inelegant way of phrasing it, and I'm sure, I'll go to Lynn in a minute after I've gone to Lindy, but I think if we can think of it in those terms, that doesn't get us tied up in a definition, but does actually provide some sort of interim direction, if you like. That's probably what we're looking for here. So Lindy, and then I'll go to you, Lynn.
I suppose I'm going to stop arguing with myself while I wait for my turn. I do think that an IPSAS IFRS aligned lease standard implicitly scopes it out, because these arrangements are probably set to be more of a commercial nature. I think that's what we tried to say in the BCs. I don't think the nature of the arrangements as envisaged in an IFRS aligned standard would allow for a concessionary lease without actually specifically including it in there and including something in there. So I think we kind of already excluded it. Whether we want to make it more direct, then this is what I was arguing with myself now. Other than what's in the BC, we would just be saying, well, it's not in here because it's not in here already. Whether or not we want to emphasize it. I guess maybe it's something we can look at as we get to nearing the end of this and see how far we've gotten on concessionary leases and the RFI, whether or not there could be something at that stage. But I do take the point that this will probably not become effective. And as a consequential amendment to the RFI, you can probably put something in there before this becomes effective at that stage. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. Lynn.
So a couple of observations, just picking up on Lindy's point. I guess I'm in the opposite camp. I think concession releases exist in the private sector, and therefore I think they are in here. So I guess I'm not in favour of saying if you've got a concession release, you go back to IPSAS 13. I think the reason why I'm not in that camp, and I think we ought to be really clear about managing expectations, the work that we are proposing and will do on concession releases is in the light of the leasing model that we have approved in ED 75. We know that constituents out there want us to reopen the model, and I don't think we are intending to do that or should do that when we look at concession releases further to see if there's more guidance needed when we look at the responses to the RFI. So I guess I'm in the camp that we need to be looking at those responses in the light of the lessee-lessor model that we've adopted and are intending to adopt in ED 75. I do think we do have time on our side in terms of between now and when we approve, we will have done a lot more work and might have a clearer steer on where we're going with concession releases, if that application guidance or something else. And so I think we do need to sort of keep revisiting it, but I think we need to manage our own expectations about what we're looking at in the RFI, and that is adopting the model in ED 75, how would you account for concession releases?
So, I mean, in terms of moving forward, I think clearly there is some, you know, we've got the sort of the various program management issues that have already come up in terms of, we've got the linkage between the ED 75 and what's going on in revenue. There's also, you know, linkages in the underlying standards, you know, IPSASB standards with IPSAS 41. So I think we probably just need to think a little bit about the choreography on this. And I think I'm interested, Lynn, in your point about timing. If we prioritise the discussions on the RFI responses around concession releases, that would probably give us a sort of even an early indication as to what we might say to our constituents on this, and the tone of what we might say. I think there's also the point that Ross very effectively, you know, very clearly made, which is in terms of effective date for the new leases standard, that must play in with this. So I think if we can ask staff to sort of, if you like, take that, you know, massive things that we need to do away and think about what probably would be a couple of different options for how we might do this, without actually explicitly scoping concessionary leases out of this standard. So in other words, we're supporting the overall way forward, but we're saying that there's a very particular communication issue that needs further consideration in terms of options, and we probably will not be able to, so we probably need those options worked up, and we will not be able to take a decision on those options until we've at least seen what people have said on concession releases and where we think that might go. Is that a reasonable summation of the discussion? Ross, from a staff point of view, you're content that that gives you sufficient to move this forward?
Yeah, I think it does. I think we'll write up the decisions and instructions on this, and you know, we'll think through the plan and how we're going to work that forward for September.
Okay, thank you for that. So with that, Joanne, move us then into the final item, which is the just the sort of choreography generally, planning generally in terms of how we're going to move the project forward.
Yes, thanks, Ian, and thanks to the board, because this puts it in a very good place for this final agenda item on the project management of the leases project going forward. I'm going to share the screen now. The issues paper brings a proposal which basically is summarized in this slide. So this slide starts where we ended in the beginning of this session, so with a review of responses and project direction at this meeting. So as the board has already spoken about RFI and the review of responses and specifically the concerns with concessionary leases for the scope of this standard. So staff then will prioritize that issue along the lines while still finalizing ED 75. So for that case, we'll be bringing from December 2021 going forward all the issues related to the RFI, but bringing first the concessionary leases. So it is expected to be approved, the final IPSAS on leases in June 2022. But of course, if we are able to prove it earlier, depending on how we deal with those issues that constituents raised on ED 75, even better. But I'll highlight what Ross has already mentioned, that although we might approve it earlier, in March, for example, but we might not have it published until the new standard on revenue is also published. So we might only anticipate from the leases project the approval of the standard, but the publication is dependent of the publication of the standard on the revenue. Once we settle on this standard, we go to the finalization of the next exposed draft related to the concessionary leases and other arrangements similar to leases, expected to be in September 2022. Of course, we will have a comment period, review of responses, and to finalize its approval in December 2023. It is expected that might be some changes to the current standard, but might also have changes to other parts of our literature once we settle on this last phase of the leases project. So with this, what I ask the board is whether it agrees with the staff and task force recommendation to address the remaining issues related to ED 75 according to the schedule that it is in the agenda item 2.11, so the upfront table, project timetable, and to finalize the leases on lease based on ED 75 and the issues raised from the review of responses according to the schedule in the agenda item 2.11. So, and with this, I ask the board whether it agrees with this recommendation. Thank you.
Thanks, Shra. So open to comments. David.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. No, there was a little hiatus there. I'm just slightly concerned about this, the last box at the bottom of that slide that Joe showed us, where we're talking about approval of an IPSAS called concessionary leases, etc., etc. I think at the moment, I would prefer that we were talking about a final pronouncement, because it might be, depending on the analysis of what comes out of the RFI responses, it might be that it's just a question of making some amendments to an IPSAS on leases. We don't know yet. So I think we don't want to preempt our decisions.
Thanks, David. And I saw support from members for that. So if we can just make that clarification that we talk about final pronouncement. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. And so I support the direction that Joe is proposing. I had a question. I wasn't sure whether we needed another 2 or 3 meetings to deal with the issues that are on Appendix B in 2.2.1. But if that's the time frame and that's the resource implications, then I'll support that. But I had a question on reconciling the project map in 2.1.1 and the Appendix B items in 2.2.1, where we refer to the issues, and one of them is definition of a lease, whether consideration is only cash. So I couldn't find that particular line in the project plan. Is it being merged with something else, or how's it being addressed?
Yes, thanks for highlighting that. So actually, you are quite right. So there were several comments related to the consideration, and in the timeline, it is saying concept of consideration, which is a kind of an umbrella terminology that we find, which is related to the nature of consideration, to the level of consideration, and so all. And I wanted to aggregate that discussion in a holistic approach to the concept of consideration. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sharon. I'm not seeing any other flags raised, so I think broadly we're okay with that in terms of the way forward on project management. So, João, I think that's it on leases for this meeting. So thanks very much for the analysis, and I think very helpful in terms of the board's given clear direction on the key elements of that project. We'll see more papers on the detailed issues coming forward in September and then December. So thanks for that. Ross, anything else from your perspective before we close the public meeting?
No, nothing else before the public meeting. Just thanks to members, TAs, observers for making time for this check-in. We know this is kind of hitting up against people's vacation plans and summer breaks in the Northern Hemisphere. We really appreciate the time. It's been really effective on both natural resources and leases today, and really helps us on the staff side move things forward for the September discussions. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. So thanks everyone. I think that was a very useful discussion, and as Ross said, that gives us that sets us up well for September. With that, I'll close the public session. We will then, in terms of the members in camera session, we'll start that in 5 minutes time.